Now, I wonder, when was the last time you had a quick read of the book of Ezekiel? Head-changing questions. Probably, a book that you've not read all the way through, that you've just read, like we heard Richard read a section from chapter 37 this morning. But it's worth having a look at. To give you a feel for the book, I want you to imagine that you are around about 25, living in a very prosperous city, the capital city of your country, and then one day, everything comes crashing down around you. A mighty foreign power invades, ransacks your home, takes the best and the brightest from the community away into exile in their own land, and you are amongst that group. Because that's what happens to Ezekiel as he sees the Babylonian army sweep in and take so many from Jerusalem into exile, himself included. But then some 5 years later, whilst he's still in Babylon in exile, God comes to Ezekiel in a vision. And Ezekiel sees 4 creatures, each with 4 faces, traveling in formation. And within this, as God opens out this vision to him, Ezekiel glimpses the very presence of God. And he is called to not lose hope. And Ezekiel is called also to share that message with those in exile. And he says to them time and time again, God will come to us. Here in exile, God will come to us. And it's interesting, through the book, Ezekiel says some 65 times, or God says through Ezekiel some 65 times, then they will know that I am the Lord. And so Ezekiel starts to talk to the exiles. He starts to tell them these words of hope, but they don't listen. They refuse to listen. He speaks out against violence and injustice, the worship of false gods. He calls them to return to God, who, if and as they do, promises to return to them. But still, they refuse to listen. The Jews in exile had given up hope in God. And they assumed or presumed that God had given up hope in them. And through the sweep of the book, we see that although Ezekiel is faithful, even he finds himself wondering if God has really given up on them. Is God done with us for good? Have we blown it completely? With all of this, doing our own thing, going our own way, too much apathy, too much turning away from God. And for us today, as we look around us, there are times, I'm sure, when we can find Ezekiel's question resonating with us. Is God done with us? Is God done with his creation? As we see so much in the way of conflict, so many natural disasters, as we see a growing secularization and an apathy towards God. But then we might also wonder, is God done with the church? Dwindling numbers, increasingly marginalized. But then even closer to home, we might even wonder, is God done with me? I don't feel like I'm good enough. I want to be better, but I just can't seem to get round to it. Does God hear my prayers? Is God done with us. And as Ezekiel ponders that question, so we see how God speaks through this vision of this valley of bones, and God says a resounding no. And we see God says to Ezekiel, and through Ezekiel to his people, God says, I'm going to do something new, something that you would think impossible. And we're introduced to this vision of a valley full of dry bones. And I don't know about you, but as I read it again in preparation, that song comes to mind, doesn't it? Then bones, then dry bones, and they're all connected, and we might remember which is connected to which, but that comes to mind. But what we see in the book of Ezekiel, this prophecy, is this vision represents the whole house of Israel. It represents God's people in exile who were saying, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off from our land and from our God, abandoned, lost, with no way out. And as God reveals this vision to Ezekiel, so we see how it challenges his faith. God says to Ezekiel, what do you think? What do you think? Can these bones live? What do you think? Can the state of the world, can the state of the church ever get better? Ever rise from such depths of hopelessness and despair? And Ezekiel says, you alone know. You alone know. And as he says that, as he responds to God, so we see that Ezekiel is being called to have an active trust and hope in God. He is going to be part of that sort of fulfillment of the vision, if you like. He's not called to sit back and do nothing. He's called to have an active trust and hope. Ezekiel is called to look past the limits of his present circumstances, and he is called to see, to hope in God's plan and purpose. And we know how it works out. God asks Ezekiel to prophesy, to speak God's intention, to see beyond the limits of his own vision. And we see this slowly developing image of new life as step by step and stage by stage, these bones are brought back to life. We see in this a lesson for us today, maybe, and that is that we're called to never allow our present situation to shape or determine our view of God's future. God's plan for his creation, for his church, for his people will come about. It might not be what we would want to do. It might not be in our time. We might not see it. Many of the exiles never got back to Jerusalem. They never saw the new temple. But that doesn't mean God will not fulfill his promise. We today are called, like Ezekiel, to have faith, to stand within our present circumstances, and yet not to lose sight of God's promise. And we're reminded too, as we look at this vision that Ezekiel has, we're reminded it's not our job to make miracles happen. Rather, we're called to simply believe that they can. I guess we could say that God comes to us today and asks us the same question that he asked Ezekiel. Can these bones live? Can this situation, the world, the church, my life, can this situation change? And I guess that our answer depends upon how we see. Do we see things from our own limited perspective? Or do we try to see things from God's perspective? From our perspective, the answer might well be no. There's no way these things can get any better. We've just got to put our heads down and make the best of it. I guess in a sense, from our perspective, we might echo the words of those who were exiled. Our bones are dried up, our hope is gone, and we're cut off from God. But the challenge of Ezekiel is that we can also see things from God's perspective. And so when God comes to us and says, can this situation change? Then perhaps we need to echo something of the words of Ezekiel when he says, you alone know. You alone know. And as we respond like that, so we rediscover that, like Ezekiel, God calls us to an active trust and hope in him. Amen.